Good morning and a very warm welcome to the DGAP morning briefing. The German Council on Foreign Relations hosts this Thursday briefing every Thursday morning to discuss current challenges, geopolitical challenges in the world. And my name is Guntram Wolff, and I'm the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And today I'm really pleased to host a session on China and how to engage China economically and geopolitically. With us is today a star panel of three really outstanding speakers. I'll list them in the order of in the speaking order. So Vivian Wang is the China correspondent of the New York Times, based in Beijing. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in Beijing from Beijing.
Thanks for having me.
And our second speaker will be Michael Pettis. Michael Pettis is a very well-known economist. He's at the Guanghua School of Management at Beijing University, professor of finance and a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie. And really, I'm a big fan, Michael, of your research work on the Chinese economy. And very much remember how we first met in Beijing a long time ago. Thanks for joining. And our third speaker is Arancha González Laya. She is the former foreign minister of Spain and currently the dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po. Thank you so much, Arancha, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So today we want to hear about current developments in China, both on the political front as well as on the economic front, before then turning to implications for the world and for the European Union in particular, and then engaging with you, our esteemed audience, in our usual conversation in the chat, but also here live online. So thanks so much for joining. And without much further ado, Vivian, give us a sense of what is the current thinking and the current developments, key developments in the Chinese political system.
Sure. So I'll try to give a very brief high-level overview. I'll first talk about the international front and then on the domestic side. So internationally, the big events that most people here have been paying attention to for the past few weeks have, of course, been the meeting between Xi Jinping and Biden in San Francisco. And accompanying that, there has been a pretty dramatic turn in Chinese rhetoric about the United States, definitely a pretty dramatic softening, looking at President Xi's remarks, which were, sort of conciliatory, sort of trying to stall the falling off a cliff of relations, and especially if you look at state media's tone, which, for many months, arguably years, had been extremely hawkish and negative on the U.S. And then in the weeks before Xi went to San Francisco, suddenly became really quite touchy-feely, even in some places, really long stories about President Xi's longstanding friendships with the American people, a lot of emphasis on people-to-people exchanges. But the general consensus, of course, is that this is not a real turnaround in relations. It's sort of a détente at best, sort of an effort to build a little bit of a floor before the 2024 U.S. presidential election, which could certainly send things right back through the floor. So we will definitely have to see how that goes. And the agreements that came out of the U.S.-China meeting, such as, for example, China agreeing to try and stop the fentanyl flow to the U.S., are notable, but I think most analysts believe not that significant or certainly, not huge victories. And then on the domestic front, there's been certainly a lot of high-level political intrigue here. We have seen several high-level officials removed from office or sort of disappear, including, of course, the foreign minister, Qin Gang, the defense minister, Li Shangfu, and several high-ranking officials in the army. But I would say that on the ground, the feeling is not that has posed any real challenge to Xi Jinping's authority. It might have raised some questions about his judgment because he was often the one to sort of handpick these officials, but it's certainly, we don't get the sense talking to anybody that people think that his hold on power is at risk. Likewise, just a few days ago was the 1-year anniversary of the A4 white paper protests against the COVID restrictions, but those passed very quietly within China. I think there's, a lot of sort of malaise and processing still among many people about what happened during the 3 years of COVID restrictions. But as to whether that poses any sort of real political challenge, I would think no, at least certainly not in the immediate term. The bigger topic that everyone is talking about, of course, is China's economy and the economic problems. That is what the government really feels like it has to address. And I think I should let Professor Pettis talk about that part.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for this high-level overview. And of course, the détente and the softening in the US-China relations is a trigger for me to ask you again whether it is a détente, a softening in the relation comparable to what the famous person that actually died today, Henry Kissinger, achieved in the in a different era, really, where he really was the architect of the détente between China and the US. And since then, it has only become more adversary and more difficult, this relation. And now, of course, President Xi was in San Francisco, and is this the start of an attempt to sort of reorganize the world order and come to grips with each other as equal players, or how do you interpret this?
I think it's certainly, this moment of détente, if that's what it is certainly not comparable to what Kissinger helped kick off. And even on Chinese social media today, the reactions to Kissinger's death are very much sort of, oh, it's the end of an era, it's the end of that time of US-China relations. There's a broad recognition that, we're not going back to that anytime soon. As far as sort of whether this is a moment of repositioning the relationship, there have been some analysts who have said that even as President Xi went to California with a not overtly aggressive tone, what was notable about his remarks to President Biden were that it was sort of seemingly the first time that he has outright acknowledged the concept of sort of a long-standing, going forward competition between the two countries as major powers. In the past, China has generally rejected the U.S. framing of competition and sort of said that that word competition, that framing is the U.S. attempt to contain China and urged the U.S. to take a more friendly or conciliatory stance. But President Xi's remarks this time sort of seemed to signal more of a recognition or an acknowledgement that this is going to be a long-standing major power competition going forward. And the question now is really how to manage it, not necessarily avoiding that competition framework.
Thanks so much, Vivian. So Michael, we've heard about sort of the relation and how it is evolving. And one important dimension is, of course, the economic dimension and the huge adjustment that China should be undertaking, but isn't really. So is China going to increase even further its exports, its export share to the rest of the world? I mean, how do you see the economic adjustment interact with the politics here, and what will?
Well, the good news about the economic adjustment, I think, is that many more people are talking about it today than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And this is an adjustment that, basically we were promised in March 2007, when then Premier Wen Jiabao acknowledged the deep imbalances in the Chinese economy and promised that they would start rebalancing the economy towards more consumption and less investment. To give an idea of how successful that's been, in the 15, 16 years since that speech, the consumption share of GDP has gone up by maybe 1 percentage point, certainly a lot less than 2 percentage points. And for China to be a normal, low-consuming country, consumption would probably have to rise by 10 to 15 percentage points. So it gives you an idea of just how unbalanced the Chinese economy is. We've never seen these level of imbalances before in history, even though we've seen many countries follow China's growth model. This is a very an extreme form of a standard high savings, high investment model that many countries have followed since the Second World War. And all of them have had very difficult adjustments. So it's important for us to understand what the adjustment is going to involve in China. And I said the good news is that there's increasing recognition of the kind of adjustment China needs to make. The bad news is that, in the past, the role of government was largely to pick the winners among the direct and indirect transfers from the household sector. The adjustment means the opposite. The role of the government is now to pick the losers. And of course, that's a much more difficult, complicated process. And so for me, the bad news is that we're not really discussing the obverse of the rebalancing. If you increase the household share of GDP, you must reduce somebody else's share. So the good news is we're talking about increasing the household share. The bad news is that we're not at all discussing whose share has to contract in order to increase the household share. But what I wanted to talk about is something a little bit different. On the political front, it seems like there are better relationships. China and the U.S. are talking more. China and Europe, perhaps not so much, but at least there's an attempt on both sides. But I'm a little bit pessimistic about the outcome because I think the fundamental economic problems within the relationship are likely to get worse, not better, as China tries this adjustment process. And, there are some very useful numbers. And what's interesting is that the arithmetic is really simple. This doesn't require advanced math to figure it out. According to the World Bank, manufacturing represents roughly 16% of global GDP. And it varies, but within a tight range during this century from 13 to 17%. Now, of course, that's not true for every country. Some countries have a larger manufacturing share and some have a smaller. And what you'll find as a general pattern is that countries with large persistent surpluses tend to have a much larger manufacturing share, and countries with large persistent deficits tend to have a much smaller manufacturing share. So, for example, the U.S. manufacturing is roughly 11% of GDP. That's not a surprise because the surplus countries are basically countries in which transfers from the household sector have subsidized the manufacturing sector, making them extremely competitive, and as a result, their global share has grown. Now, this has always been a problem, but when China was 4% or 8% of global GDP, it didn't really matter. China today is the second largest economy in the world. It's roughly 18% of GDP. The U.S. is around 25% of global GDP. But when you look at manufacturing as a share of the Chinese economy, it's really astonishing. It's about 27%. Now, I checked all the World Bank data, and I found only 3 countries with a higher manufacturing share. And as soon as I mention them, you'll all know why they have a higher manufacturing share. The 3 countries are Ireland at 38%, Liechtenstein at 34%, and San Marino at 33%. So basically, their manufacturing shares, the reported manufacturing share, is hugely distorted by what some might call predatory tax policies. Excluding those 3, China has the highest manufacturing share in the world. Now, why is that important? It's important because China, as I said, is about 18% of global GDP. It comprises only 13% of global consumption. That's how unbalanced it is. But it comprises an extraordinary 31% of global manufacturing. So China, which is less than a fifth of the world, is nearly a third of global manufacturing. Does that matter? It matters if you expect China to continue growing with its current manufacturing intensity. Now, I should tell you that Chinese manufacturing is 27-28% of GDP. It used to be 32%, and it started to come down, which is typical in most countries, until about 2 years ago. And then, weirdly enough, it started to rise as a share of China's GDP. And it's important to understand why. This is when the property crisis began. And what we've seen is a massive shifting of investment out of the property sector, but total investment continues to rise. And the result, and the reason is because part of that has been an increase in infrastructure investment, which Beijing doesn't want to do because infrastructure is recognized as increasingly non-productive. But a significant explanation for the rise in total investment has been the shift of investment out of the property sector into manufacturing. Now, manufacturers complain about lack of demand, not about lack of capital, but we're nonetheless seeing a big shift of very cheap capital flowing into the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing share of GDP is likely to rise in the next few years, and that has important implications. Now, the numbers I'm going to tell you assume there is no increase in the manufacturing share of China's GDP. I think that's an unreasonable assumption, but I wanted to take the current level and see what happens if China continues to grow over the next 10 years at 4%, 5%, without reducing the manufacturing intensity of its growth. And what we see, and again, the arithmetic is very simple, is that after 10 years, China's share of global GDP will rise by about 3 percentage points to around 21%. China's share of global consumption will rise by less than 2 percentage points to about 15%. China's share of global manufacturing will rise by more than 5 percentage points. So from 31 to 36%, 32 to 37%. I'm sorry, did someone say something?
Yes, so it's a massive shift towards manufacturing, and perhaps we can just sort of cut you here and get back to you in a second. And I would love to actually also get Vivian back on exactly the question of the that I think you pointed out, this shift towards the adjustment that would have to be undertaken would involve massive shift of purchasing power of resources to consumers, but at the expense of someone. And so that's why it's so difficult to engineer that, right? And so perhaps we can have a conversation about that as well. But sorry, before we do this, we have to stick a little bit to the order. I do want to get in Arancha because this adjustment problem, and Michael, the way you describe it, I think is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it really shows that unless the world takes up massive excess capacity from China, China is going to run into real troubles. And if the world doesn't do it, of course, the relations with China will be in big trouble. So perhaps Arancha, you can give us a bit of a sense of the European discussions.
Could I
yes.
Could I just have one more line, because I wanted to draw the conclusion, and the conclusion simply is that if China continues to grow with this manufacturing intensity, it can only do so if the US, Europe, India, Japan all agree to reduce the manufacturing shares of their own economy by an average of 0.5 percentage point of global GDP. I think that's very unlikely, but unless that happens, we have a global overproduction problem.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Arancha, please.
Thank you very much. Let me just focus for a moment on the relationship between the EU and China, a relationship that is becoming, in diplomatic parlance, a little bit more challenging. A few elements on what has changed in the relationship, and then maybe the two things that have not changed. What has changed first is the intensification of the US-China rivalry, with both sides feeling vulnerable vis-a-vis each other. What has changed is the rise of climate change as a priority in international affairs and a big focus for China and the EU for different reasons. On the EU side, because this is where Europe has made a big political gamble and a big effort, and on China, because this is where a massive reduction in emissions is required. What has changed also is in Europe, a more negative perception of China, in particular as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the perception that the European citizens have that China is siding with Russia. What has changed is China's technological prowess, that basically now a prowess that is projecting in the rest of the world, with China competing more with the EU on this especially green technology sector. What has changed also is a global economic outlook that is more hostile today than it was in the past. So this is the landscape of the things that have changed that in a way shape the manner in which the EU and China will interact. Now, what hasn't changed? Two things haven't fundamentally changed. First is the EU's geopolitical weakness. The EU is a big success economically, but it has not managed to project this economic success into political integration that would give it the ability to be a more geopolitical player. And what hasn't changed, and Michael just explained it very nicely, is the Chinese economic weakness. The idea that there would be a dual circulation has not worked. What has not changed is the over-reliance by China on exports as a model for its economic growth, with a very subdued domestic consumption. And this is what is creating regularly overcapacity. It varies. It used to be on steel and aluminum, now is on electric vehicles and batteries, and the list goes on, which basically, in my view, speaks of the necessity on the Chinese side to rebalance more in the form of building a stronger social safety nets at home. They've done part of this, a very small part of this, on the healthcare sector as a result of COVID, but much remains to be done if they really want to move part of their savings into the domestic consumption that for the moment they are not capable of leveraging. What hasn't changed also is a massive and growing trade deficit between the EU and China, and trade deficit that will only get bigger if the investments that China was making in the housing sector are redirected towards the green technology sector, which is where China is in direct competition with the EU. Now, having said that, I think there are 4 areas where the two could build a positive agenda. In my view, that it is important to build a positive agenda. The first one is around climate change and sustainability more broadly. And on climate change, I think the space to collaborate is on carbon pricing and on developing further the cooperation on carbon markets that at the end of the day would be extremely important moving forward. Where there is a way to cooperate is on the trade and financial side, understanding that the cooperation has to be about managing the growing landscape of trade irritants that will turn into an outweigh conflict between the two if they are not managed properly. Where there is a space to collaborate is on digital ecosystems, where if I look at the regulatory frameworks that are being developed in China, there are interesting things happening, including on artificial intelligence and the rest. And finally, where I think there is a space to work is on the people-to-people exchanges, on students, on getting to know each other a little bit better, which will be a requisite for a more stable relationship. So, Guntram, back to you.
Arancha, thank you so much for these very clear points and I think very clear overview. I guess perhaps one just very quick follow-up question, and then I want to go back to Vivian, is really on the climate and sustainability agenda. Yeah, and I mean, basically, if we take Michael's point about sort of the boosting of the manufacturing sector, and if more in China is going to be in the green manufacturing sector. In a sense, that's good news, but also bad news, right? I mean, it's good news in the sense that we will get all this cheap solar panels, you name it, and they will become cheaper and cheaper, and we can roll them out around the world with really positive effects on climate, on emissions. But at the same time, of course, we are all trying to build this industry ourselves. The United States does it big time with the Inflation Reduction Act. And the European Union is struggling to define what exactly is going to be its industrial policy, and what are really the edges in that industry that we still want to keep. So how do we square that circle in the relation with China on that particular front?
No, you're right that the good news is that the overcapacity on green technology will help decarbonize around the world a bit more broadly, understanding that there are many parts of the world where all these efforts are still to be undertaken. The bad news is that we are direct competitors, not just with China, also with the US, and that the main tenet for the EU, which is keeping its markets open, not just as an ideological choice, but because this is how the EU manages to also grow, a growth that is also dependent on the openness of other markets, requires fairness. And we have a double challenge today of unfair competition on the tech sector, both from the US as well as from the Chinese side. My sentiment is that on China, this has to be part of a very robust conversation between Europe and China about the fairness of the competition in the green technology sector, because if this does not happen, what we will see is a closing of the EU market for Chinese green technology. And the first warning shot has come from the electric vehicle investigation opened by the European Commission. But, my sense is that if there is no amicable way of addressing this overcapacity issue, there will be a less amicable way of addressing it.
Thank you so much, Arancha. And Vivian, let me ask you that question again about that Michael raised, which is really about sort of the shift in purchasing power, the shift in resources towards consumers that China should, in principle, undertake, isn't happening. And so probably it's not happening because it means there will be people losing. What do we know about the losers? Is it local governments or is it officials? How can we think of this problem of shifting economic power in China?
Well, I think many of us know that local governments are already in a huge sort of financial crunch after the financial burden of having to carry out so much COVID testing, all of the lockdowns. And, that has had very real world implications. We've heard reports of civil servants not getting paid, of bus service getting cut. So, already the painful implications of that are becoming somewhat clear. I also, and Michael can probably speak more clearly to who exactly the losers would be or maybe should be. But I also want to highlight that, even if there were to be a shift to the consumers, if there were, for example, an expansion of the social safety net, as Arancha mentioned, I think those would all be very helpful and necessary adjustments. But a big problem that you hear right now from sort of quote unquote ordinary people, be they entrepreneurs or just regular consumers, is the confidence problem. And I think that, that kind of ties to what I was saying earlier about whether or not any of the problems currently pose a real political challenge to Xi Jinping's administration or regime. I mean, not in the sense that, there are street protests or that there's any kind of tangible sense. But, of course, politics is how people think about everyday life. The past 3 years have really affected people's daily decisions about how they're going to spend their money, how they're planning for the future. And ultimately, that is political. I think there really is a crisis of confidence. And so even if there were to be real tangible measures in shifting money towards consumers, which again, we haven't really successfully seen, I think there's still an open question of whether they would be willing to spend it in the ways that the government really wants.
Well, Michael, perhaps you want to talk a bit about this shift, this necessary shift as well. And let me also read to you a question from the chat already, and then I come to Philipp Nilsson and Hartmut Fischer afterwards. The question is about, Götz Schellers is asking about your projections in the shift of the global pie. What does it mean in terms of when will China surpass the US in terms of global GDP? When will China be equal to the US in terms of world currency reserve, US dollar in terms US dollar reserve currency status? And what impact shall we expect along China's path for Europe and the US? So perhaps you can take those two questions quickly, and then we come to the next set of questions.
I'll answer them very briefly and very unsatisfactorily because they need long answers. But basically, I've never believed that the Chinese economy would become the largest in the world. I think we're making the same mistake we did. We forget, but in the 60s, every intelligent person knew from President Kennedy right on down that the Soviet Union would overtake the US economically in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, everyone knew that Japan would at the beginning of the century. And we made the same types of mistakes. We didn't distinguish between what the Hungarian economist János Kornai referred to as hard budget constrained growth and soft budget constrained growth. The latter you can get a lot of, but it's not sustainable. It's the former that matters. As for the reserve, I will also say the renminbi will never be the dominant reserve currency. In order for it to do so, China would have to do things that are clearly not in its interest. And I think it knows that. I think the people who say that they want the renminbi to rival the US tend to be political people, foreign affairs people. I think economists don't really believe that can happen. And if anyone's interested, I wrote a piece for the review of Keynesian economics earlier this year or late last year that explains why. My answer's already getting long, but to address Vivian's issue, there are only a limited number of sectors that can pay, right? In an economy, you've got households, you have to raise their share, so obviously they can't pay. You have foreigners, too small to matter. You have businesses. If businesses pay for the adjustment, you undermine the economy. And finally, you're left with governments. That's the only sector left. And Vivian mentioned that local governments are in trouble, but they're in trouble from a cash flow point of view. Local governments actually own a lot of assets, some estimates between 20 to 30% of GDP. The best way for China to resolve the adjustment is ultimately by forcing local governments to liquidate or transfer those assets in ways that increase the household share of income. This is a very complicated issue. I don't want to get into a long explanation, but ultimately it will probably be local governments who pay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So Philipp Hirse-Menzel and then Hartmut Fischer, and then we take always two in turn. Please, Philipp.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Question, please. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating insight. On this point of overproduction, I mean, obviously we're speaking here, most of us, from a country that's also famously overproducing and exporting more than it should. And if you speak to most economists here, they seem to think that's a great thing. And that's very sustainable. At least that's the majority. I think Guntram wouldn't contradict me there. That's the majority opinion of German mainstream economists. So coming from that, and with a view especially to clean tech, but to everything, do you see a space where there could be some sort of understanding, a compromise between the three blocks, the US, the EU, and China, on what would have to be sort of I assume, less exports and essentially more internal consumption. And how could that look? Question mark.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Philip. And indeed, the German example, of course, immediately comes to mind. But let's get one more question. Hartmut Fischer, please, you raised your hand. We can't see you, but perhaps.
Okay, great. Hello. I've got a 3-section question, I believe. For one, if the EU wants to have an effect on the world stage with this issue and with others, it seems there has to be a shift to some kind of majority type of decisions, at least in the foreign policy, economic policy arena. If that step is not taken, I don't see the EU being effective, and the EU doesn't mean it seriously to have an impact on the world stage. The second being that China should have an interest in reducing, in staying close or somewhere within the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming arena, because my understanding is that they're basically a strongly business-driven country, and if the kind of disruptions that climate change is going to bring is going to hurt their economic success, stability of their own society. So it should be possible to have even if you're competing in other arenas, that you have a strong cooperation on that area that can have positive impact on other areas of where you meet. And in terms of using their production capacity to help transform the global economy to CO2-free, batteries, solar panels, etc. I don't quite understand why we don't take a double tier. I mean, that capacity is there. The main point is that we don't destroy our own economy or, in these sectors, or where it's basically non-existent, grow it to a reasonable level so that we're not completely dependent on Chinese imports, and that you say we're open to imports and competition up to a degree of, 30% autonomy or something like that, 40%. And then above and beyond that, we'll have Ausschreibung, what's the English word for that? Tenders that say, you have to have X% local or EU content to go in, and then it'll be a few cents, maybe 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour more expensive, but then you've got the resilience in your economy. So that would be a win-win. You don't destroy your own economy, but you use the capacity that the Chinese have. And if they want to subsidize their solar panels, well, for the moment, I would say it's great. Use it. What's the problem? As long as you keep the resilience in your own relevant sectors.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. So perhaps, Arancha, you want to take the question on the majority voting and the 1.5 degree, and then Michael, you go for the other 2 questions. Arancha?
Yeah, I would say, let me first on this issue of, the US, China, and Germany. I mean, frankly speaking, the US could do a little bit better with also spending a little bit more in strengthening its social safety nets, because the backlash against open markets in the US, the legitimacy for open markets, is also a function of the underinvestment in social safety nets. So that, in my view, is what is to be done on the US side. On China, the investment on the social safety nets, which is another means of unlocking more of the domestic consumption, has to be done for a different reason, mostly because if you over-rely on exports to fuel the Chinese economy, it will find a more hostile international environment, and this will put at risk its own growth prospects for the future. As for Germany, I would be very discreet about the advice I give. I give a screen full of very eminent German economists, but I guess Germany could also do a little bit more in terms of fueling its own domestic investments in sectors such as digitalization, which will be essential for continuing to keep a competitive edge in the future. On the EU, I mean, trade decisions are basically in the EU about majority voting. So there is no, on the economic and trade side, the bulk of the decisions, bar for fiscal, are essentially a majority voting. What is not a majority voting today is on the foreign policy political side. And finally, I find it a bit difficult for the EU to embark on a big managed economy program, mostly because the EU has a difficulty, given what the EU is, a collection of states that are also competing with each other, to organize in a too Soviet style, quote unquote, the manner in which it will manage the green economy. What I see is the possibility, the necessity for a dialogue between the EU and China, as well as between the EU and the US, about where will we put the limits of unfair competition. And this, we've seen this in the past. We saw this in the past with Japan. We saw this in the past with Korea. We saw this in the past between the EU and the US. And now we need to put a bigger effort between the EU and China.
Michael.
This is something that I can harangue on. Actually, I think one of the big confusions is between exports and surpluses. So many people will say, in Germany, for example, that being efficient at exports is a good thing, which it is. So therefore, running surpluses is a sign of vitality, of strength, which it isn't. One of your finance ministers even said the reason Germany runs a surplus with the United States is because Americans correctly value the quality of BMWs, which is an incredibly silly thing to say, because in the 1990s, Germany was running deficits. And I don't think there's any evidence that in the 1990s, Americans thought BMWs were badly engineered. It's got nothing to do with the perception of engineering. What we forget is that the purpose of exports is to maximize imports. Surpluses don't do that. Germany ran deficits in the 1990s and surpluses after the Hartz reforms, and it's pretty easy to explain why. In fact, I use that in my classes here in Beijing. And that is, after the Hartz reforms, you'll notice that the relationship between wage growth and GDP growth broke. Wages ended up growing much more slowly than GDP, which is a way of saying there was a huge shift of income from German workers to German businesses. Profits soared. As a result, German savings went up, German consumption went down as a share of GDP, and the very weak domestic demand in Germany had to be externalized in the form of a trade surplus. So the problem is not exports. And of course, if Germany wants to subsidize exports, if China wants to subsidize exports, so the rest of the world should take advantage. But if the subsidies come at the expense of domestic demand, then all they're doing is they're subsidizing exports and externalizing the cost to the rest of the world. That's the problem. It's not the exports, it's the surpluses that are the problem. And by the way, there's nothing new about this. Keynes warned about this in 1944 at Bretton Woods. You can't allow countries to run persistent surpluses because that puts downward pressure on global demand.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, for recalling some basic Keynesian economics, which is not always the top of the reading requirements in economic classes in Germany. But I think it's still very important to read that. And I think I think you very much struck a chord with me, at least. Because during the Eurozone crisis, I mean, we had exactly these debates and the adjustment periods afterwards about, will we get adjustment in German external surpluses or not? And for quite some time, actually, the adjustment was mostly done by the so-called deficit countries, while the surplus country, Germany, didn't adjust much. And that had, of course, some deflationary effects. And anyway, so now we are in a different era. The energy shock last year fixed the problem at some levels. So it cost Germany 4 or 5 percentage points of its GDP, and the surplus came down. But anyway, so I'm straying away. We wanted to talk about China, but I do think this adjustment issue that we experience within the Eurozone is actually a good example of the global problem that China poses. And the Chinese surplus model clearly will create major political pushbacks, and both in Europe as well as in the US, and as well as also the global South. And one question here is about the global South. What will be the reaction of the global South, and will China not orient its model towards the global South? So perhaps also Vivian can talk to that issue of the global South. But I do want to bring in also Peter Linke, please. Peter Linke.
Very much. The question is a bit away from what has been debated so far. I would, for a moment, return to the Xi-Biden meeting. One of the questions that was raised at the meeting was high on the agenda, pretty high on the agenda, at least judging from American sources, was the question of technology, especially the question of artificial intelligence, and here especially its military applications. Do you have any ideas on that?
Wonderful, thank you so much. So perhaps Vivian, you can take those two points. Talk a bit through the global South and the dual-use artificial intelligence question. You are muted, I believe.
Sure. Just on the second question, can you specify a little bit more the question, I suppose? Like, are you just thinking, what was discussed about artificial intelligence and sort of technological restrictions, or yeah, I think I didn't fully get the question.
Well, the question is what is being discussed at all. So in the forefront of the meeting, there was debate, especially, well, at least in the American media, that one point would be artificial intelligence on the agenda, especially the military applications, especially as far as nuclear security is concerned. Nuclear deterrence, questions like that. After the meeting, well, at least I haven't heard anything about it. It didn't figure during the press conference. It didn't figure afterward. So that's why my question: were these questions raised at all during the meeting, or did they kind of not being part of what is being debated?
Sure. Yeah. I'm sure you saw a lot of the speculation before the meeting going in, when I think some of the wildest was that, there could begin to be a framework about the use of artificial intelligence in military capacities. But I think, even before the meeting had begun, there was already a lot of poo-pooing and sort of downplaying of that idea, because that would be really quite major. And I think that, limitations on China's military is certainly not something that Beijing has proven eager to talk about. If I'm recalling correctly, I think there were also some of the more tempered expectations where that maybe there would at least be an agreement to start a committee or to start some sort of dialogue about that. But I'm honestly not even recalling whether that ended up being a concrete outcome of the meeting, in part because, as you pointed out, it really seemed to be not a focus. I think maybe one thing that we can look at that we did get a little bit more information about was the resumption of military-to-military communications. Just today, the foreign ministry here in China had affirmed that it was going to be officially restarting those communications. But even that, which was touted as a significant outcome of this meeting, unlike the artificial intelligence question, many experts and analysts that I've talked to have sort of even downplayed the significance of that, because they've suggested, there were probably already sort of lower level, middle level communications going on. And the communication that goes on at the highest level between the defense ministers of the two countries, for example, is potentially more symbolic than anything else. And, when it comes to technological restrictions, when it comes to sort of concerns about Chinese students, say, going to the US and studying artificial intelligence or other sensitive areas, America has made very, very clear that it's not going to budge on those areas. So I don't think, basically in short, that there's been a lot of progress or a lot of dialogue on that front. And as for the question about the Global South, I mean, certainly the line from Beijing is that, they're going to be sort of focusing more on the Global South and not on trying to cater to or win back these Western markets that in some cases may be, may prove inalterably hostile to China. I think that, that's part of this broader paradigm shift that China is hoping to market, at least rhetorically, which is that we are recasting this American-led world order. We're going to, sort of look at expanding BRICS, for example. We're going to try to turn to these other countries that maybe have been dissatisfied with American leadership for some time, but for a long time didn't have an alternative. And now we, China, are going to be that alternative. But as far as actual financial input in terms of BRI, I mean, China, again, rhetorically remains very committed to BRI, but of course we've seen pushback from other countries about predatory lending, about other concerns. And of course, there's also the question of how much money China can actually continue to put into these initiatives when it's struggling at home economically. So, I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think that, there's always a division between the rhetoric, basically, and the reality in both what we were just talking about with artificial intelligence and with this paradigm shift that China wants to lead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vivian. And Arancha, perhaps you can also speak to us a bit on those two dimensions. I mean, one dimension is the BRICS Global South dimension, and the other is the security dimension in the relation between the West, the US, and China, but also Europe and China. France, and you're now at a French university. France has an Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the EU has it as well. So there is the whole military dimension where Europe sort of thinks there it has a role to play, but the real player is, of course, the US. And how do you interpret sort of the discussions between Xi and Biden on this dimension? I would be very curious to hear from you as well.
Thank you. I think the military defense security is the area where we are not on the partnership or on the competition, but we are on the rivalry side, on the part of this three-part lens with which both the EU and even also the US, but also others, whether it's Japan, whether it's Korea, whether it's Australia, is looking at. Now, the problem on this rivalry part is that as a result of the last tensions in the last months, the floor that you need to have in any rivalry situation, which is basically having at least male-to-male cooperation dialogue, which we saw was a bit weak during the balloon incident. I take the meeting at the APEC summit at putting that floor in terms of military-to-military dialogue, and I think this is good news. Now, is this enough? Can they also build spaces where a bit more is done, including on the area of artificial intelligence? I think that's going to be more challenging, although I would note that in the recently event hosted by the UK on artificial intelligence, China was invited, and China did sign on to the communique that came out of that meeting. So you've got a bit of yin and a bit of yang, as it's usually the case. More yang than there's yin, to be fair, on the military side. On the Global South, first, I don't think there is a Global South. It's a very important political reality, but if you start unpacking behind the South, and you start with the BRICS will be in direct competition with China on the green technology too. Brazil would want, who has also its own ambitions on industrialization will be on a collision course with the exports of our capacity from China on the green tech sector. Same for India, who has its own ambitions. Same for South Africa, who has its own ambitions. So, I mean, I think on the south part, there is part of the south that would be benefiting from access to technology that China has available and in surplus, in excess capacity. Others would be more nervous because this would mean heightened competition for their nascent industry. So their ambitions to also become manufacturing hubs for this green technology. So a mixed picture, which again speaks of probably the need to treat this issue of overcapacity in the green technology sector in a more cooperative manner, possibly by bringing actors around the table, like was tried at the time in the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, wonderful. So we have one last question or comment, again by Hartmut Fischer, on the China-EU relations as regards the CO2 reduction, and how do we effectively implement CO2-free economies and therefore prevent drastic humanitarian economic turmoil in the decades to come. I mean, so far we are mostly discussing de-risking and pushing against unfair competition, which is all important, but a far cry from solving the larger challenges. And I mean, perhaps this is a good moment to also refer to the COP. I mean, the COP is starting today, and we know that the COP is falling short of delivering on what it needs to deliver on, namely massive reductions of CO2. And China is among the countries that actually is still on the path of increasing its emissions, and its emissions are by now 4 times that of the European Union, despite all the green technology here, but it's just coal-fired power plants. And so the big question to me is China going to become the cooperative player there, really pushing and advancing the green transition around the world, or is it going to continue to export its own model, which is still very much coal-fired power based? I mean, I think that's a really, really big question. And perhaps, Vivian, you want to say a few words about, each of you, for a few words about that, and then we conclude. But really just sort of a headline answer, and then we are actually up to the hour.
Sure. I would just say that this is yet another example of sort of the classic tension between China's sort of statements on one hand about the West holding it to unfair standards and the West having been allowed to emit and pollute and industrialize and become a world power. And on the other hand, China's ambitions to show that it is a responsible major power. And so in that sense, it really has sort of a PR incentive to lead on the climate issue and to be a cooperative player. So we don't necessarily know which of those two interests is going to win out. We know that President Xi is not at COP, nor is President Biden. But I think that, in many, many realms, be it foreign policy or the environment or whatever, we see sort of this tension between China's rhetorical ambitions and perhaps more practical calculations.
Michael, do you want to say a word about this decarbonization challenge? And I think you're muted.
I don't really have anything to add to what Vivian and Arancha.
Yeah, Arancha?
So if you look at where the US and Europe are betting on cooperating with China, is on climate change. If you look at the area which has gotten a bit warmer as a result of the APEC summit, is climate change. If you look at where the EU is investing efforts with China, is on climate change. So in my view, this gives us an indication that of the whole list of issues that both the US and the EU could pick from, they think they can pick more cooperation with China on climate change. Now, the jury is out, as Vivian says, but let's look at what happened last year on the Kunming meeting that took place in Canada on the protocol on biodiversity. So basically, how seriously countries take protecting biodiversity and restoring biodiversity, this is an area where China put its agreement to ambitious targets. So jury's out, but I mean, from what I can see, this is an area where there is more hope of a good cooperative space than others.
Wonderful. This brings us to the end of this morning briefing. Let me extend a big thank you to all three of our speakers, Arancha, González, Vivian, Wang, and Michael Pettis. It has been really a wonderful and fascinating discussion about the multitude of facets of the relation of China with the world and with the European Union and Germany, of course. So thank you so much to all of our listeners and also to the whole DGAP organizing team for having organized this event so wonderfully. Thank you, and until next week, bye-bye.